The first time I saw the pipeline slicing through my ranch, I felt a cold rage coil tight in my chest. Water, the lifeblood of this land, was being stolen right beneath my feet, funneled away without a word, without permission. That moment, standing on the edge of my drying spring, I knew this wasn't just about water. It was a war, and I was ready to fight back. The sun was barely up when I heard the rumble, not thunder, not trucks. Something deeper, like the earth itself was groaning. I grabbed my boots and ran outside. The ground vibrated under my feet. Dust hung in the air like a curtain, and then I saw it. A yellow bulldozer rolled across my pasture. Behind it came men in hard hats dragging pipes longer than school buses. Trenches already cut deep into my land. The smell of gasoline mixed with fresh-turned soil. A man in a vest barked orders. Another laughed. My cattle had scattered to the far hills. I ran up to the nearest worker and shouted, "What the hell are y'all doing on my land?" He barely looked at me, just pointed to the woman stepping out of a black SUV that didn't belong on ranch dirt. She wore heels. On a ranch. Designer sunglasses. Hair too perfect for this wind. The kind of woman who thinks a fence is something her landscaper installs around a pool. She walked straight toward me like she owned the sky. "You must be Jake," she said. Her voice dripped with that soft menace rich people learn at country clubs. "I'm Clarissa Monroe, president of the Elmswood Ridge Homeowners Association." I blinked. "And what the hell does that have to do with tearing up my land?" She smiled. "Progress. The HOA board voted to install a water pipeline for our community. Lake. It's all been approved. Legal. Necessary. And unfortunately for you, already underway." My voice caught in my throat. "You're building a pipeline through my ranch." "Technically, it cuts across the northeast quarter, the part that borders Municipal Development Zone 3. You never filed land use objections during the hearing window, so we exercised our rights." "What hearing? I never got any notice," she shrugged. "Public notice was posted in the Town Gazette. Page 13, small print. But still, legally binding." I stepped back. My fists clenched. My heart pounded in my ears. "You can't just take my land, you still own it," she said with a chuckle. "We're just helping ourselves to the resources flowing underneath it. Besides, you weren't using that spring for anything important. Now it'll serve 500 homes. A community pool, 2 fountains, maybe a golf course one day." I looked past her. At the giant pipe they were lowering into the trench. It gleamed in the sun like a sword sinking into the flesh of the earth. My earth. My father's earth. My grandfather's earth. "This is theft." "No, Jake," she said. "This is progress. And if you keep interfering, I'll have to call legal. Or worse, the county. You wouldn't want code enforcement sniffing around those unregistered structures by your barn, would you?" She turned and walked back to her SUV. The worker next to me chuckled and shook his head. "Tough break, cowboy. Should have kept up with the times." I stood there as the bulldozer roared back to life. My pasture was now a construction site. My spring, my lifeblood, was being stolen 1 inch at a time. I watched as Clarissa drove off without a speck of dirt on her wheels. That night I sat at the kitchen table staring at the stack of legal documents I'd printed from the county site. Permits, variances, utility easements, all wrapped in language so dense it might as well have been in Latin. I called a lawyer, left 3 voicemails. Nobody answered. By morning, the creek behind the barn had dropped 2 inches. My cattle huddled near the last muddy patch of water. I filled troughs from my emergency tanks, but they wouldn't last more than a week. I drove into town, waited 3 hours at the zoning office. When I finally got someone's attention, he shrugged and pointed to the forms I'd already seen. "HOA has a standing agreement with the county to develop shared infrastructure," he said. "If no objection was filed during the notice period, there's not much we can do, but I didn't know, no one told me." He shrugged again. "It's your responsibility to monitor land development notices. They're public record," I wanted to scream. Instead, I walked out and drove straight to the HOA office. Elmswood Ridge sat like a wound on the hillside. Rows of beige homes with plastic, grass and driveways cleaner than hospital floors. A security gate scanned my license plate. A cheerful voice told me to wait. After 15 minutes, a woman with too much perfume led me to a glass-walled conference room. Clarissa sat at the head of a glossy table with 6 other board members. They looked up like I was interrupting lunch. She gave me that same smile. "Jake, so glad you came. You're draining my spring," I said. "You need to stop. We're improving community resources," she said. "And we've done everything by the book." "Your book," I growled. "Not mine." One of the board members snorted. "He's not even a resident." "That's right," Clarissa said. "And as such, he lacks standing to file internal appeals. This is my land." She leaned back in her chair. "Not anymore, at least. Not the part we care about." I took a step forward. "You can't win. You think I'm just going to let this happen?" She stood, smoothed her blouse. "I don't think, Jake. I plan, and I act. That's the difference between you and me." I left before I broke something. By the end of the week, my well had run dry. The main spring barely trickled. I stood over it one evening as the sun set in blood-red streaks. The silence was louder than any scream. My sister called, told me to sell the land and leave, said it wasn't worth fighting, that the world didn't care about old ranchers with broken fences and dry soil. I didn't answer. That night I couldn't sleep. The stars blinked like a million distant eyes watching me drown in anger. I looked at the ceiling and whispered, "You want water. You want power. You want my land." My voice was calm, almost a whisper. "Then I'll show you what happens when you take something without asking." The days after the pipeline started flowing felt like watching a slow-motion disaster unfold. The HOA trucks came and went like an invading army. Clarissa's smile grew wider each morning as she announced new expansions: sprinklers on the golf course, fountains for the community park, luxury homes with automatic irrigation. But beneath her polished veneer, the land was dying. My ranch was bleeding water faster than it could breathe. I stood on the ridge one afternoon, the wind whipping dust into my eyes. The spring that once gushed clear and cold was now a mere whisper, barely enough to fill a bucket. My cattle clustered around the last muddy pond, tails flicking away flies that never should have been there. The air tasted of dry earth and desperation. I ran a hand over my weathered face, worn from years of sun and sweat, and realized the fight was far from over. Clarissa came by that day, walking up the dirt road with a drone buzzing above her head, filming for the HOA newsletter. She wore her usual confident smile, the one that said she had already won. "Jake," she called out sweetly, "don't get in the way of progress." Her words sliced sharper than any blade. I told her to get off my land, but she just laughed like I was some foolish cowboy dreaming too big. That night, I sat on the porch under a blanket of stars, the silence heavier than the dark. My mind raced through options, but the legal routes were dead ends. The county had sided with the HOA, the courts were slow, and Clarissa had connections everywhere. I wasn't a man used to losing, but this was shaping into a war I couldn't win with fists or shouting. I remembered old Pete, a retired hydrologist who had mapped the springs and aquifers around here decades ago. If anyone knew where the water came from, it was him. I drove the dusty roads out to his ramshackle cabin perched at the edge of the mountains. Pete greeted me with a crooked smile and a knowing look, as if he'd been waiting for me all along. Inside, maps and water charts cluttered the walls. Pete pointed to a spot miles upstream from my ranch, a narrow strip of land where the spring fed the entire valley. "That's the source," he said, voice rough from years of smoking. "If you control that, you control everything downstream." His eyes twinkled with a spark of mischief. "Problem is, it's up for sale." I felt something shift inside me, a spark of hope tempered by a bitter truth. The HOA had never bought that land. They were siphoning water illegally, relying on my goodwill and ignorance. If I could own that source, I could cut off their supply, starve their pipeline, fight fire with fire. The next morning, I called my lawyer and a water rights expert. Money wasn't easy to come by, but a recent settlement from my late mother's estate gave me just enough. I put in an offer for the upstream property through a quiet LLC, making sure no one suspected a thing. The deal went through faster than I expected. Within days, I held the deed to the land where the spring began. With the purchase complete, I hired engineers to help install a control valve hidden deep in the forest. No one could see it from the road or the drone cameras. It was my secret weapon. I spent long nights poring over plans, plotting every detail. The more I learned, the clearer the path to revenge became. Meanwhile, the HOA kept celebrating their community water project with parties and press releases. Clarissa gave speeches about growth and prosperity, never once mentioning the dry land behind their gated walls. She was drunk on her own power, blind to the storm brewing just beyond her polished smile. I drove past their ribbon-cutting ceremony one afternoon, blending into the crowd unnoticed. Families sipped lemonade while children splashed in the artificial lake. I watched from a distance and felt a cold satisfaction. They thought they owned the water. They thought I was defeated. Back on my new land, the valve was ready. I ran my hand along the cold metal, feeling its weight. The power was in my grasp, but I held back. Let the HOA burn a little longer in their arrogance. Let the water run dry for their lawns and pools. When the time came, I would flip the switch and silence their false paradise forever. That night I lay awake listening to the sounds of my land. Crickets chirped and an owl hooted, but the creek was silent. The silence was a promise, a warning, a beginning. I whispered into the dark. You wanted war. You'll get it. And I meant every word. The morning sun spilled golden light across the valley as I made my way back to the source land. The air was thick with tension, a quiet before the storm I was about to unleash. I carried a simple remote device, wired to the valve that controlled the spring's flow. The engineers had assured me it was foolproof. One flick and the water would stop. No more pipeline feeding Elmswood Ridge's sprawling lawns and fountains. No more theft. I remembered Clarissa's smug face when she thought she had me cornered. How she dismissed me as an irrelevant relic of a fading ranching past. How she believed her HOA had the power of law and money stacked high against a single man. But she underestimated something I learned long ago. When cornered, desperation breeds cunning. I sat on the edge of the creek where the valve was hidden, watching the water gurgle through the pipes beneath my feet. My fingers hovered over the remote's button. I hesitated, heart pounding like a war drum. This wasn't just about water. It was about justice, about reclaiming what was stolen, about proving that the strongest weapons don't always come from courts or contracts, but from bold, decisive action. Suddenly my phone buzzed. It was a message from an unknown number. Clarissa. Jake. I know what you're planning. Stop before you make this worse for yourself. I smiled to myself. The first crack in her armor. She thought she controlled the game. But I was about to flip the board. The next few days I watched the HOA's world unravel in slow motion. Water pressure dropped in their pipes. Sprinklers sputtered and died. Golf greens turned brown and brittle. Social media buzzed with complaints and angry posts from Elmswood residents. Clarissa tried damage control, issuing reassurances and blaming. Technical glitches. But whispers of sabotage started to spread. One afternoon she confronted me on my land. Her eyes flashed with fury as she demanded I restore the water flow. You're jeopardizing lives, she hissed. Families need that water. I met her gaze evenly. Families also need truth. You stole from me. You built your paradise on my ruin. She scoffed. Your rights don't matter anymore. Maybe not in your eyes. But I hold the key now. She lunged forward, rage cracking her polished mask. Security guards rushed over to pull her back. I turned away, letting her fury fuel my resolve. The HOA board scrambled to find legal loopholes. Threats flew in letters and emails. But the truth was plain as the dry grass choking their lawns. Without water, their empire was crumbling. Then came the tipping point. At the HOA's annual gala, where Clarissa was to be crowned Woman of the Year, the sprinklers failed spectacularly. Cameras captured fountains sputtering and dying mid-toast. The guests whispered and laughed behind raised glasses. Social media exploded with memes mocking the thirsty HOA. Clarissa's face turned red with embarrassment and panic. She stormed off stage, eyes searching for me in the crowd. I stood calmly, savoring the moment. But I wasn't done. Using my phone, I streamed live footage from the source land. The valve, the dry pipes. The rusted sections where the HOA's greed had eaten away at nature's balance. My narration cut through the glamour and lies. This is the truth behind Elmswood Ridge's water crisis. Not technical failure, but theft and arrogance. The video went viral overnight. Local news picked up the story. Public outrage boiled over. County officials announced investigations into the HOA's permits and water usage. Clarissa's allies started to distance themselves. That night, I sat alone in my ranch house, listening to the distant sounds of sirens and protests. A slow smile spread across my face. The battle wasn't over, but the tide had turned. I whispered into the dark, "You wanted a war. Now you're losing." The morning after the gala felt like the calm after a storm, but beneath it simmered a chaos ready to explode. Elmswood Ridge was no longer a pristine neighborhood but a battlefield where trust had been shattered and power questioned. Clarissa's polished smile was gone, replaced by a mask of desperation that barely concealed the cracks in her carefully built empire. Her calls went unanswered, and invitations to meet with county officials turned to demands for accountability. Watched it all unfold from my porch overlooking the parched creek that was once the heart of my ranch. The water still didn't flow, but neither did my patience. I had struck the first blow, but the final act was yet to come. The HOA board convened in emergency sessions behind locked doors, trying to salvage their reputation and water supply, but the truth had become a wildfire, consuming everything in its path. One afternoon, Clarissa arrived unannounced, standing at my gate, her posture rigid, but eyes wild. "Jake, we need to talk," she said, voice stripped of its usual arrogance. There was a flicker of vulnerability beneath the surface, like a storm about to break. I let her in, but kept my guard high. She confessed the pressure was crushing, neighbors turning against her, investors threatening to pull out. The pipeline shutdown had crippled the community's image and finances. For the first time, I saw her not as a villain, but a woman trapped by her own ambition and the consequences it wrought. But the damage was done. "I underestimated you," she admitted bitterly. "And I don't know how to fix this." I leaned forward, feeling the weight of years of betrayal and hard-won resilience. "You built your kingdom on stolen water. There's no fixing that, only reckoning." Her lips trembled, and for a moment the ruthless HOA president was just a person afraid of losing everything. Then she straightened, the old mask slipping back on. "This isn't over, Jake. I'll find a way." I smiled with quiet certainty. "So, will I?" Days later, the county commissioners held a public hearing where residents poured out grievances and evidence of the HOA's illegal water use. Cameras captured every heated exchange. Clarissa sat pale and silent as the room voted unanimously to revoke the HOA's permits and impose heavy fines. The pipeline was ordered sealed and the land restoration began under strict supervision. Elmswood Ridge was broken, but so was the illusion of invincibility that once surrounded it. Social media was flooded with memes and viral videos lampooning Clarissa's downfall, turning her into an unwitting symbol of greed and entitlement. Her power stripped away piece by piece, until she was a shadow of the woman who once ruled the community with an iron fist. I stood at the edge of my ranch, watching. Water returned slowly to the spring, the land healing beneath my feet. The cattle drank deep and the earth sighed with relief. The battle had scarred us all, but justice had been served in a way no courtroom could deliver. As Clarissa packed her things in a quiet farewell, the news crews asked for her final words. She looked directly into the camera and, with a forced smile, said, "Sometimes the biggest mistake is thinking you own something when really it owns you." I chuckled to myself, remembering those words days later when a viral meme surfaced online. showing her in a lawn chair, parched and surrounded by empty water bottles captioned, "Thirsty for Justice." I poured a glass of fresh water from my well and raised it to the sky. The fight had been long and brutal, but the land was mine again. The pipeline was silent. The spring was free, and so was I.